Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Hello and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you're tuning in. Thanks so much for joining me on the program here. My name is Andrew Lawton. You're listening to Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. And we are still in the midst of election fever. I have to warn you. Now, this will be the penultimate show before the election. So my embargo that I laid out a few weeks ago, that I wasn't going to necessarily talk about everything overtly political that I could think of every show, I've made good on that promise. What I said several weeks ago is that I'm going to talk about politics when I have something to add, something to offer, or when I am looking at an angle that is distinct from the general narrative of the campaign. And now that we're getting down to crunch time, though, I think all the rules of engagement change, basically. We're going to be doing something a little bit different, though, later on in the show today. You see, we spend so much time talking about what Stephen Harper's doing, what Justin Trudeau is doing, what Thomas Mulcair is doing, what Elizabeth May is drinking. We spend so much time doing that. Oftentimes, we forget that there are other parties on the so-called fringe that, even though they are unlikely to form even a minority government, even in many cases to get a seat in Parliament, they still have something to contribute to the national discussion. Or at least they think they do. So yes, later this show, I want to actually focus a little bit on shining the light on the so-called fringe parties, and we're going to be chatting with the leaders of two parties that are vying for votes from the right, who have a very different vision for Canada than that put forward by Stephen Harper. We'll be joined by Rod Taylor from the Christian Heritage Party, the leader of that party, and also joined by Tim Moen, the leader of the Libertarian Party of Canada, and we'll talk to both of them, not at the same time, although that would be an amusing debate, the Libertarian versus the hardline Christian conservative. But no, we're going to be talking about what the issues of the campaign are to them, independent of one another. That's coming up later on in the show, and some other little political goodies as well here on the Lawton Online podcast. But I wanted to kick off on the show today by talking about a story that is surprisingly not getting a great deal of media coverage, and it's actually a few days old now, but I assumed it would explode. I assumed it would become a lot bigger than it was, and while there was some reporting on it, it didn't really galvanize people like I would have expected. And it is one of these things that comes unfortunately close to putting myself in an area where someone could accuse, now it wouldn't be true, but accuse me of politicizing a tragedy, which is not what I'm doing nor what I'm trying to do. Instead, what I'm trying to do is bring this around to a theme that I like to discuss on this show on a regular basis, and that is the idea of reclaiming personal responsibility. Yes, the once ever abundant reality that was people taking responsibility for their actions no longer seems to be a contender in people's day-to-day lives. And the story that really ties into this is the death of Paul Walker. Now, Paul Walker died at 40 years old in a high-speed car crash. Now, he was the actor who was in the Fast and Furious movies and a number of other ones. To be honest, I had no idea that was almost 2 years ago. I thought it was basically like earlier this year. I didn't know it was actually in November of 2013 when he died, but he did. He was not the driver, but he was in a Porsche Carrera GT that was going at very high speeds, above the posted speed limit, and the driver at one point lost control, and the Porsche ended up crashing into trees and a hydro pole. And it killed Paul Walker. So let me be very clear here. I'm not trying to take away from that tragedy. But I do think that we need to call a spade and acknowledge the absolute absurdity of a lawsuit that's now been filed by his 16-year-old daughter, Meadow. Now, I think it's inexcusable, first off, to name your child Meadow Rain, but let's set aside that for a moment here. He died, left her at a very young age, and now she's suing Porsche for unspecified damages, alleging that Porsche contributed to Paul Walker's death. The lawsuit reads, "The Porsche Carrera is a dangerous car. It doesn't belong on the street, and we shouldn't be without Paul Walker or his friend Roger Rodas. He was the driver." The lawsuit also says, quote, "The vehicle lacked safety features that are found on well-designed racing cars, or even Porsche's least expensive road cars, features that could have prevented the accident or at minimum allowed Paul Walker to survive the crash." Now, Porsche has responded to this, basically saying that they believe the authorities report that the crash came from reckless driving and excessive speed, not a vehicular malfunction. The 2005 Carrera GT has some safety features, but the suit says it lacked side door reinforcement bars and it had defective rubber fuel lines and should have had an additional electronic stability control system. The fact is, they were not driving the car in a lawfully prescribed manner. Investigators think the car was going between 80 to 93 miles per hour on a road that had a posted speed limit of 45 miles per hour. And I think this is something that is very important here because I, by the way, want to make something as well known that I do not object to people going fast. As a matter of fact, when I take my little Ford on the road, I sometimes go like a whole 10 kilometers over the speed limit. No, sometimes even more, although I'm not going to admit with numbers what I do. Frankly, though, I should tell you that my objection to going really fast has nothing to do with public safety, nothing to do with my own safety, and everything to do with not wanting to get a ticket. That's it. I just don't want to get a ticket, and I don't want my insurance to go up. If I were on the Autobahn, I'd be like zooming down that thing at 150 probably. But the reason I bring that up is because we all know that speed can be dangerous. There are a number of things that one can do in a car that are dangerous. If you drink and drive, is that the fault of Smirnoff? Is it the fault of Budweiser? Is it the fault of Seagram's? No. If I smoke pot, get into a car, and get into an accident because I'm driving high, who is that the fault of except for myself? And ultimately, I think this is where we really go off the rails here in society when we look for answers in ways like this, because we're not actually looking for answers. It's a blame game. And you know what? Meadow Walker, I feel bad for her because she's dealing and grieving with the loss of her father, and she's had some trigger-happy ambulance-chasing lawyer that's jumped on board her team and said, hey, we can make a point here. It's the same people after the Sandy Hook shooting, the parents that got together. Their grief was seized by trial lawyers who then sued Bushmaster for making a gun that was used by Adam Lanza. And they know they're not going to win. They're trying to grandstand, they're trying to chest thump, and they're trying to make some point that corporations are so evil. And the fact is, Porsche has created a product that people can buy and use responsibly or irresponsibly, such as they want to. And that's not anyone else's fault but the driver. Now, if they wanted to sue the family of the driver of the car, the driver's dead, so you can't sue him, then maybe you have a case. But if they were going slower, the accident would not have happened as severely as it did, and certainly would not have been likely to claim the life of Walker and his friend, who were not intoxicated. They had no drugs or alcohol in the blood. The airbags went off. They were just going at such a high speed in an area that was clearly not meant to be like that. And they were racing team partners. They probably thought that they could be better at it than they were. Or maybe a bird ran out in front of them and they swerved. I don't know what the case may be. But I know that it's not Porsche's fault. And If this were a standalone case, I would be less inclined to find it to be that problematic. I'd say, you know what, the case will get thrown out and that's it. But it's that every time something bad happens, now someone is looking to sue their way into wealth and fame and fortune about it. And I'm not saying that those are the motivations here. I think genuinely the motivations are actually coming from a place of just not being able to say no to lawyers that are talking about how great an idea this would be. And not to knock lawyers. I have a number of them who I'm sure I'll need to hire at some point in my life. But let's face it, they are not always a scrupulous bunch. We know this. And I know when you need one, you need one. So again, I'm not knocking lawyers wholesale. I apologize if that's the way it sounds. I'm going to have the microaggressions against lawyers. But what I want people to know here, what I want people to be abundantly clear of, is how integral it is to the restoration, if you will, of society. I was trying to think of a good word there, but the restoration seems to make sense. That we stop trying to always blame someone else when something bad happens. This is what we've lost the ability to do with today. To deal with problems, to deal with things that we go through, to deal with the circumstances that have presented themselves in our lives. We have to find a way to make it someone else's fault. And whenever I see these ridiculous lawsuits, like the Bushmaster lawsuit, for example, which was one of the most absurd, and these have a history of being thrown out in U.S. courts, but people still file them. Bushmaster sued, I think it was in the millions of dollars. I can't remember the exact dollar value, because of the death of the children and teachers in Newtown, Connecticut, in the Sandy Hook shooting. Now, when this happened, people respond and say, well, something has to be done. So what do? They sue. They go to the courts. And as Conrad Black has written about extensively, there is a huge problem in the U.S. justice system in general that I think applies to civil suits as well, in terms of the way that it is such a court-happy country with little in the way of jurisprudence to actually show for it. But where do we go from here? The fundamental question that I think still remains. Where do we go from here? I think for starters, we need to recognize that the answer to all of life's problems is not something that's going to come through a lawsuit. You can't sue your way to prosperity. But the motivations in so many of these cases are not even financial. That's the problem. It is on principle, but not even the good kind of principle, not even the kind of principle that we're actually supposed to respect. But it's actually what's more concerning to me in this that I wanted to explain a little bit here, which is that people are suing in these cases because they don't want to acknowledge fault in themselves. They don't want to acknowledge that they could have possibly done or said anything wrong, or that someone they loved whose life was tragically lost may have done something wrong. And it also comes down to, I think, people not being able to recognize that sometimes shit happens. Sometimes shit happens, and I know that's not the words of inspiration and motivation that people want to hear, but sometimes we have to be prepared to accept, as Rush Limbaugh has famously remarked in a monologue that went viral, that life isn't fair. Is that going to be much in the way of support for Meadow Walker? Hey, sorry, Meadow, life's not fair. Your dad died. It sucks. No, that's terrible. But it's also life. So are we to blame her? Absolutely not. Are we to blame Porsche? Absolutely not. No, we're to blame this culture that searches for answers in all the wrong places. So much so, and so vigilantly and quote-unquote diligently, that it feels that the answer to these problems, the answer to these woes in life, comes from trying to make it someone else's fault. Why don't we sue the government, saying, well, you clearly didn't keep this car off the street, therefore it's your fault. Sue the government, you didn't ban that gun, so maybe it's your fault. Sue the government, you let that guy out on parole. It's not his fault, it's your fault. All right, well, why don't we make the government pay for it? Why don't we really go full blown on this, go nuclear, and make it so that anyone who had a part in any part of the process, from start to finish, From the conception of the idea to the execution of it, anyone who is involved in that, it's your fault. You sold the bullet that loaded the gun. You made the gun. You sold the gun. You invented the trigger mechanism that gun used. It sounds ridiculous, but this is more and more towards the direction that I fear we are headed now, unless we slam the brakes on it and really start to tell people. This is the message that we need to impart to our children. Bad things happen in life. The measure of a person is to make sure they are not responsible for the bad things happening in other people's lives, and to learn to deal with, live with, and move on from the bad things that have happened to you and around you. And that's true when you deal with loss of life. That's true when you deal with tragic accidents and other forms. And it's true in virtually every other way as well. But no, it's the precious snowflake generation. We'll be talking about another story not connected to the personal responsibility angle, but related to that when we come back in just a few moments. But personal responsibility, it's like common sense, in that neither is all that common anymore. When we come back, more Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. Stay with us.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.Media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
And we are back here on Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. Well, this next story actually hits a bit close to home for me, because it takes place at my alma mater, unfortunately, Western University, formerly the University of Western Ontario, and they've, well, not actually changed the name on the paper, but they've changed the way people are supposed to talk about it. In any case, it is actually quite surprising, because for all the qualms that I have with university culture and politics, Western I always found to be pretty much on the right side of issues. That doesn't mean that they always made the right calls, but on the free speech issue, the school has always been, I think, more squarely on the right side of history than not. And I go back 5 years ago when I was involved in a large effort to bring Ann Coulter to Western as part of a nationwide tour. And despite people trying to have the event shut down, despite people trying to make sure that it did not go on, the president of the university, still the president today, Dr. Amit Chakma, has said, we need to be able to entertain all ideas in the interest of being a free-thinking and open-minded liberal institution. And the event happened. Well, Western Student Union has gone a different direction now. Now, it's important to qualify, this is the student union, so all they can really do is make recommendations, but the fact that this poster campaign exists is, I think, a mark of the unfortunate times in which we live. The school had its orientation week this week, and as part of the orientation program to acclimate new students to the school, they decided to start a language awareness campaign. Now, the goal of this, as you can probably imagine from the name of it, is to foster respect and civility among new students, and of course, returning students as well. So the campaign, and you can look at all these pictures on Facebook, has a number of black and white posters showcasing grim-looking students beside a quote explaining why the particular pupil has eliminated a certain turn of phrase from their vocabulary. Now, I wrote about this on the Megaphone, and I'm hoping you can check that piece as well, because you can also see a little bit more in the way the examples of this poster campaign. Now, some of these things are, I'm going to say, rooted in common sense and common courtesy. Like, I don't say fag because it's triggering or harmful to people of different sexual orientations. People saying in the posters, I don't say retarded because it's offensive to people of different intellectual capabilities, etc. These things are pretty commonplace or commonly known, rather, to not use. But the whole campaign, even the ones that have a bit of merit, I think is discredited by other words and sayings and phrases of little consequence to any sensible person that managed to make the list. One poster features a young lady saying, quote, "I won't say I was blind to something," because it ignores the experiences of differently abled individuals. Man up is off limits because, of course, we can't show the idea that, quote, masculinity is innately superior, unquote. And going down that vein, grow up hair is also out. Whitewashed is bad because it's racist. Ratchet is bad, which I had no idea was a problem. I did not know ratchet was a bad word, but I learned that ratchet is apparently, quote, racist, classist, and sexist, unquote. Now, I didn't know why this was, so I did something that's quite regrettable. I tried to look into it. I tried to look up ratchet classist, and of course I found this like digital rabbit hole that I wish I had never climbed into of feminist ranting and rampaging about certain words. And apparently ratchet was once used to describe lower class, working class black women in Louisiana, and as such, saying something is ratchet is apparently an offensive word or term. Yeah. Now, thank goodness Western has no automotive classes. I'd hate to be the student that's running afoul of the guidelines by asking if he can borrow a ratchet, not realizing that he's ignorant to the plight of the poor women of the bayou. But other words that are on the banned list are insane, crazy, gingers, bossy, lame, depressing, skinny, gypped. Slaving away is bad. Freak is bad. So words that are of little consequence to anyone, that are inoffensive to any sensible person. I realize you're talking about a university here, but still, they are, I believe, still home to some sensible people. But here's the absolute best part, and by best I mean the most terrifying part. Every single one of these posters is accompanied by, and I kid you not, a trigger warning. Because even looking at a poster designed to bring awareness to the issues of racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, etc., even that needs a trigger warning. Yeah. And even on the Facebook page, in advance of all the posters, links and phone numbers to crisis centers, emergency responders, and of course a reminder that you can always call 911 if you're in need of medical attention, because even looking at a poster is so likely to send these precious snowflakes into an emotional tailspin that they need to have a trigger warning lest seeing a word bothers them. Now, this is all in dedication and search of a safe and inclusive and welcoming environment for all identities. Now, dare I say, most of the words on the, now I should warn you, there's a trigger warning attached. The blacklist, yeah, because apparently that's probably not allowed too, are words that people would not sensibly use in polite company anyway, like I was talking about earlier. Like when they blame fag and retard, rightfully for being respectively homophobic and ableist. But skinny is bad? Depressing is bad? This whole thing is frankly depressing. Slaving away? I've never met a black person who has been offended by that, nor anyone else. Now, the great thing about a campaign like this is that the jokes really do write themselves. Someone said on their Facebook page, I believe it was a Western student, said, "I'm offended by the black and white posers. It's insensitive to people who are colorblind." One person wrote, and he was actually the opinion editor of the Western Gazette, which is the Western University student newspaper. He wrote that, "Is boom offensive to people who like fireworks?" Because he was talking about another story that tied in with this. But herein lies the crux of microaggressions. No one needs to actually think that a word is objectively or even ostensibly offensive. Someone can just claim it was. Now, I joked in the blog post that I wrote for the Megaphone, I was far more offended by the words status as tropes and cliches than I was about their status as microaggressions, because I think it's more of an offense or an affront to the English language to use terms like "that's so gay" to express disdain. And I reminded myself of Western's sensible call on the Ann Coulter event. in which they said, either intentionally or unintentionally, that they were going to support Ann Coulter's right to be heard. Not because they supported Ann Coulter, not because they liked Ann Coulter, but because they recognized that, you know what, no one has the right to be shielded from different viewpoints. No one has the right to pretend as though the world does not involve conflict, debate, discussion, even, dare I say, divide. No one has that right. You have the right to ignore it. You have the right to avoid it, but you do not have the right to live your life with someone else trying to put up a wall between you and the other, lest your delicate sensibilities be disturbed by whatever you've heard that you didn't like. And I look at that case, and I forget what university it was in the U.S. This was last year, and it was written about, I believe, in the New York Times or the Washington Post magazines. And it was laughable because it was revolving around a feminist who was speaking, but critical of some parts of feminism. And the school was so terrified of what was happening that they actually had a safe space set up in the school. So you could actually go and eat cookies and listen to music and play with puppies or whatever the case may be, if you were offended in the event, so much so that you felt triggered by someone criticizing your way of viewing the world. Not only did that come with a trigger warning, but it came with a special room, a safe space that you could go to, because apparently sitting in an auditorium while someone speaks is seen as being in some way unsafe. I don't know how you can make that sales pitch to students that university is where they want to go, when it's a place where the challenging of ideas is not even acceptable. Oh, no, it is. But you need to warn someone if you're going to challenge their ideas too much. Because heaven forbid we raise people that have the intellectual fortitude to come up with what they believe and defend what they believe and not feel like it is something that they are being discriminated against or violated in some way if a time comes when someone has to challenge them or someone wants to challenge them. And I find that to be the most shameful part of this. That there exists a belief that people have, widespread, by the way, a widespread belief that people have that you have the right to be comfortable at all times. You have the right to be pleased, the right to be unchallenged. We see this on social media all the time. Someone will comment on something, someone will respond to it, and then the person will say, I didn't ask for this, you don't have the right to do this. I remember seeing this last week most recently, but I've seen it every other week probably, on the Facebook page for my radio station, where I see someone weigh an opinion and then they don't like it when someone challenges them. This is what university is creating. It's a microaggression of sorts. If you so much as say to someone, hey, maybe we shouldn't say this word. Even if you're actually doing it in a good way, you're actually doing it in context. It's not even like we're talking about posters that are saying to someone, hey, gay people are fags, which would be absolutely reprehensible. No, they're saying, hey, you should be careful about using the word fag. How is that triggering to anyone? And of course, I can only imagine that the people behind this campaign are all white liberals, white secular liberals that are feeling like this is the way they can purge themselves and cleanse themselves of their debilitating white guilt. And I can think of no other alternative for this than that. Because, look, Western's a nice place. You get a lot of diversity there in some ways, but nowhere near as much as you'd get at other schools in other parts of the country and even other parts of the province. But give me a freaking break. We are not dealing with something that needs to be revolutionized here. The way people talk, the way people speak, the way people interact, this is something that is naturally fluid. And I don't think needs a poster campaign to set people on the path to peace and kindness and singing Kumbaya as they avoid any word which could be traced back in some way to some obscure Louisiana slur, for example. Honestly, and my fiance had heard of the term ratchet before. but I don't quite understand why it is offensive. And she didn't know either, except to say that she had heard the term and didn't know the roots of it. So it's like George Allen, the former gubernatorial candidate in Virginia, who was lambasted when he shouted out that word macaca to someone. And I still to this day don't know the background of that, but someone found some bizarre connection, some obscure connection to something in Africa, and therefore it became a racial slur, when in actuality, I think it was someone just not being able to come up with a word on the spot. I don't think anyone knew what that word actually meant. But again, it's all of a sudden a racist buzzword because someone said they were offended, because someone felt offended or simply claimed that they did. And I think it more often falls into the latter category there. I remember, speaking of Western, there was a piece written on Vice, which tells you, I guess, all you need to know. This was several months ago by a woman, a black woman, formerly of London, formerly a Western student, who wrote about, in her words, London, Ontario was a racist asshole to me. This was the headline of her piece. She's writing about her time in London when she was at Western. And this is one of these social justice warriors that turns everything into a campaign for something. And she wrote about the fact that it was racist that she would go to bars, get drunk, and men would say, wow, I find black women hot. This was racist because to her, this was her being objectified because of the color of her skin. It's a compliment. If someone said to me, wow, Andrew, I'm so turned on by fat men, would I complain about it? No, I would, if I were single, say, all right, let's go out and grab dinner, my lady. No, you can't be offended by someone saying that they find something that is part of your identity to be physical attractive. But even that now has been turned into a violation of the social justice welfare of the social justice warriors. And for all the criticism that Roosh attracted when he was supposed to be in Toronto and did speak in Toronto, my goodness, the guy has hit the nail on the head when he talks about the culture of sensitivity that has led to these SJWs, as he calls them, basically trying to run the show because they can't defend themselves and they can't defend their positions. We've got to take a quick break here, but do check out my piece. It's up at TheRebel.Media in the Megaphone. We got to take a quick break here. When we come back, more Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. Stay with us.
Irreverent, intelligent, and indefatigable. You're tuned in to Lawton Online with Andrew Lawton.
Well, as I mentioned at the top of the show here on Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media, we are going to talk about life on the fringes today. And I don't mean that to mock anyone who supports one of the non-conventional political parties or the unelectable political parties, but they are politically and mathematically on the fringes. Now, with that being said, the reason that I think it's important to bring this up is because in an election where so many different issues have been brought to the forefront, I thought it'd be good to talk to some of the leaders of the other parties, the leaders who maybe don't have a shot at getting a seat in Parliament, but still have something to add. So we're going to chat with two of them this segment. The first is Rod Taylor, who's the leader of the Christian Heritage Party of Canada, and also later on Tim Moen, the leader of the Libertarian Party of Canada. We'll start, though, with Rod Taylor because the Christian Heritage Party is one that has historically run candidates around the area that I live. Now, admittedly, the problem with the CHP has always been, in my eyes, that they've been a single-issue party. There's been nothing to do with anything but abortion in the party's identity in years past. Now, they're trying to branch out, admittedly, although there was one debate in the 2008 election where the Christian Heritage Party candidate answered a question on transit funding by saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I'm doing it justice still, he said, well, if we get rid of abortion, there will be more children and more people to ride the buses, which means that we should put more money into it and then make abortion legal. And that was, believe it or not, more eloquent than his answer actually was. Yeah, he ended up being fired. He was too pro-life for the Christian Heritage Party. In any case, he was one candidate. That was 7 years ago now. It's my pleasure to welcome Rod Taylor to the program, leader of the Christian Heritage Party. Rod, great to have you on the show, sir. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks for the call.
So let's talk a little bit for people that aren't as familiar with the platform, because I know that CHP does not have candidates in all of the ridings across the country, so maybe people haven't been able to hear as much. What is the party really about, apart from being the only party that is establishing itself as identifying with a religion?
Well, we're a pro-life, pro-family, pro-freedom, and pro-fiscal sanity party. We are the only party that has part of our platform is the protection of innocent human life from conception to natural death. So we would look at both ends of the spectrum there. Human beings are under attack in the womb and in their aging years. We also believe in traditional family values and traditional marriage between one man and one woman. We know that the law has been changed. We think it should be changed back. And, every Canadian that I know came as a result of one man and one woman, and all of them were allowed to be born. So we all have something in common here in this country. And then freedom of speech, freedom of religion. It's really important that people be allowed to exercise the free will given to them by God to choose their belief system. And we have a situation in Canada today, and especially some of the provincial education struggles, and Ontario is a big case of that, where certain views are being imposed on children and parents. The state is taking an active role to push through an agenda that is really a worldview. It's you could call it a religion, and it's not one that a lot of Canadians share. So we think it's important that parents be allowed to raise their children according to their conscience. And of course, doctors and nurses, lawyers, others have moral convictions about things, shouldn't be forced to do things against their will. And that's also taking place in Canada. So there's a big agenda all in those areas. And then we have policies on all other kind of, what you would call economic topics, Bank of Canada and interest rates and taxation. We do have policies dealing with all those things, and they're all interrelated.
I want to start on some of those moral and social issues for a moment, because I know that when you talk about being pro-life, for example, there are several members of the Conservative Caucus and Conservative Party of Canada candidates who are pro-life, but the party itself has said, we're not going to talk about this issue. And I know that same-sex marriage has been another one where people in the Conservatives were against it at the time, but when the opportunity came to reopen the issue, MPs voted against it. So are you fighting for issues that you're confident will be brought up again in Parliament, or are you fighting for things that you think even more mainstream candidates have written off, even if they fundamentally agree with your position on them?
Well, especially on the abortion issue, I think everyone should know by now, if they've been paying attention over the last few years, that Prime Minister Harper has really tried to keep a lid on the abortion issue. He does not really want his MPs talking about it. His party is the only party besides ours that actually even allows any discussion. But when it comes to bills and motions, he's voted against them. He's said several times that as long as he's Prime Minister, any legislation regulating abortion will not be passed in the House of Commons, and he's kind of kept that word. Politicians are accused of not keeping their word, but unfortunately he's kept that one. So we take our hats off to the noble and courageous men and women in the Conservative Party who have continued to bring up the issue and tried in different ways, and I think very reasonable ways, to advance the cause of protection for the preborn. There was Ken Epps' Unborn Victims of Violence bill in 2008. Rod Bernouge from Winnipeg, he had Roxanne's law that would have simply protected women from being coerced to have an abortion against their will. Stephen Woodworth's Personhood Motion 312, in which asked Parliament to form a committee to discuss when human life begins. A reasonable thing to talk about. And then, of course, Mark Warrow tried to bring up gender option abortion, which is taking place in Canada, where preborn baby girls are killed just because they're girls. And, the Prime Minister has worked against every one of those efforts. And to me, some of those things are issues which all MPs and all Canadians would, should be able to agree on. I mean, 90% of Canadians polled think it's wrong to kill a baby girl just because she's a girl, and yet Parliament's afraid to tackle the issue. So we think there are MPs there who, we are not running against many of them. We've deliberately held back from running candidates against some of these kind of heroic MPs who are standing up even within their own caucus and doing the right thing. But we don't think these issues are dead. I mean, people keep talking about the idea that they talk about not reopening the abortion debate. Well, we say it's never been closed. I mean, it's like slavery in the U.S. back in the 1800s. There were people that kept talking about it, and because of economic interest, the slave owners said, let's not talk about that. It's a settled issue. But finally, it was settled in a different way. It was settled so that black people were granted their status as free human beings. And we think the same thing will eventually happen with abortion. I mean, it's pretty hard to deny the medical evidence that a child, 8.5 months old in the womb and kicking and breathing, that's not a human being, that Supreme Court decision notwithstanding. So we think eventually medical evidence and, reasonable discussion among Canadians will bring this issue forward, and we will have protection for the preborn.
I know that a lot of people have, in past elections and this election as well, criticized the CHP as being a single-issue party. Now, you've said, and I've seen other candidates and seen online, that there are economic policies that the CHP is advancing. Talk to me a little bit about those. I mean, what is the CHP's position on the Bank of Canada, for example? Because this was one that you raised at the top of our interview today.
Right. Well, we think that the Bank of Canada should go back to doing what it was originally designed to do. The Bank of Canada should be producing our money. We shouldn't be borrowing. I mean, when they say money is credit, is debt, and in the world of finance. But we're borrowing our money from international bankers and paying them interest. Not very much at today's interest rates, but still, we're helping China, for instance, build a world-class navy. And we're shelling out, $79 million a day, paying interest on our national debt. We think the Bank of Canada should create money. One of the things we want to do, and this would be sort of our entry-level approach to the Bank of Canada, to create money for infrastructure for provinces, municipalities, crown corporations, which they would borrow it from Canada at zero interest for necessary projects. These aren't make-work projects. These are things like highways.
Now, hang on, though. When you say create money, what do you mean by that?
Well, of course, all money is created really out of nothing. Our current system, you go to the bank and borrow money. They don't actually have a bunch of money in there. They lend you they lend you paper money or electronic money. You go out and do the work, you pay it back, and you pay interest on it. And they have to have very little in the way of reserves. That number has gone down and down. So we're really just, borrowing money that's created out of thin air. But today, our interest and the money Canada borrows is paid to the international banks. And why don't we just borrow from the Bank of Canada, have the Bank of Canada create the money rather than someone in China?
Now, I know that obviously Canada, going back to the 30s, abandoned any sort of gold standard or any gold-backed currency. But at the end of the day, when you start printing money, which seems to be your approach, you are grossly devaluing currency. So how would that be long-term when we're dealing with a global economy, something that helps the Canadian economic interests?
Well, that would be true if you just kept printing more money. But since these would be loans, not just printing money and it's gone and then you print some more, these would be loans to the crown corporations, provinces, municipalities. And as they repaid them, albeit interest-free, as they repaid them, the money would be withdrawn from circulation again. So it would not have a long-term inflationary impact. The world finance system is pretty scary when you look at it. Money really being created out of thin air, and it's looking pretty top-heavy right now. I mean, you almost think if someone blew on the house of cards down in the States with their, is it 17 or 19 trillion dollars in debt right now? And of course, we're tied at the hip. So, our financial structures are vulnerable. But we think we should get control of them. And, of course, the number one thing we have to do is, going off the Bank of Canada for a minute, is stop spending money we don't have. As you know, under the Conservatives, we're $150 billion further in debt than we were when they took office. And now they're crowing about a balanced budget because they've come up with $1.9 billion. Well, where's the $150 billion? That's quite a shell game, I think, if you can swap $150 billion for 1.9 and say that you have balanced budgets. So the first thing we have to do is start paying off the national debt, just like a household mortgage, and establish mandatory balanced budgets.
So under a CHP government, ideally you would say no new debt and no deficits?
That's right. And we would, moreover, set aside so much per month to be paid on the existing national debt. It's not like what it's been done in recent years is if there's any money left over at the end of the year, which there hasn't been for the last 7 or 8 years, but what was happening under the Liberals and the first couple of years of the Conservative government is, there was a little money left at the end, and that went to pay off the debt. But if we set aside, like you do with your mortgage, if you have a mortgage, so much a month, and that you don't spend that money. You pay that first, and then if there's money left over, then you get your luxuries, right?
For sure. One question I would ask you to sort of close out the interview here, is there any other policy that you think, outside of what we've talked about already, that would interest Canadians about the Christian Heritage Party, for a party that, as we mentioned and as you've acknowledged, is not as widely known as some of the other major parties, for example?
Yeah, well, one policy we're very proud about, I guess, or we think it has a tremendous potential for the average Canadian is we would pay families or give families $1,000 a month, where one family member, one adult member, usually a father or a mother, would be at home with their children rather than both parents working outside the home. So that, if they're homeschooling, that the person's there all the time. If the children are in school, at least the person is there when the kids come home from school. And that would give a kind of stability in the home that, many families feel that they both have to work. And we've extended that to cover also disabled family members, elderly family members, so home care for the elderly. Rather than institutionalizing people prematurely, this would give families the opportunity to provide the best quality care for their family members. And it would free up, because in many cases, and usually when asked this question, most parents have said they'd rather be at home with their kids than working. This would free up a lot of entry-level jobs for young people coming out of school. So we don't think it would actually, even though we're talking about a significant benefit for families, we don't think it would actually cost Canadian taxpayers more than we're now spending on unemployment and other things. And for families, $1,000 a month doesn't seem like much, but by the time you need an extra car, you need extra clothes, you need fast foods, you need a babysitter, for both parents to be working. In many cases, it would make the difference between being at home and having the best quality family life, the best quality child care, and in the situation we have now.
But how many parents do you think realistically would take advantage of that? Because look, let's face it, we have a country of over 30 million. Even if, let's say, 1 million parents could fit into that as having young children and being able to stay home, that would be $12 billion a year that program would cost.
Yeah, well, what do we spend now across the country on unemployment and youth programs and trying to find work and opportunities for young people, right? What do we spend on, social costs when kids. I mean, it's proven. The stats show that children where there's a parent in the home have a more stable upbringing and usually better outcomes in school, less likely to get into trouble with the law and so on. So when you spin these things out over the years, what kind of stresses come on families where both parents are working that maybe contribute to family breakdown and so on. I think if you spin that out over the years, you might find that's money well spent and actually probably coming out ahead rather than behind.
Rod Taylor joining me on the line, the leader of the Christian Heritage Party of Canada and also a candidate in Ottawa, West Nepean. Rod, really appreciate you taking the time off the campaign trail to chat with us. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
And thank you for the call and all the best. And we certainly look forward to the outcomes on October 19th and hope that Canadians will make good choices wherever they have someone standing up for their families and for their freedoms. Duly
noted. Thanks a lot, Rod.
Thanks a lot.
I'm all for voting with your conscience. I'm all for voting with your heart. I feel like he may have lost a bit of support when he started talking about economics. I would say, stick to what you do well, and if that's the case. But hey, why not? If you can just print money to get out of debt and get out of all your economic issues, I guess maybe that's something worth considering. I feel bad now, actually, because before the interview, I was using it as a negative that they were a single-issue party, and then unfortunately when they go off that one issue, it doesn't end well. In any case, like I said, in the pursuit of democracy, we'll hear a variety of voices on this program. We've got to take a quick break here, but when we come back, we'll be joined by Tim Moen, the leader of the Libertarian Party of Canada. You're listening to Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. Stay tuned. I'm Andrew Lawton.
He's unapologetic, unwavering, and unafraid to take on the left's sacred cows. He's Andrew Lawton, and you're listening to Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media.
We are back and continuing our series of the leaders on the fringe. And I want to stress that I don't mean this as a slight. I think that voting with your conscience is often one of the most noble things you can do. Also one of the stupidest things you can do, depending on the election. Then again, I voted for the Freedom Party in one election because the PC party was just not doing it for me, and I'm not committed in any election going into it. So I do think that if there's a candidate that's saying the right things, if for no other reason than to reframe the debate, that's not really something to scoff at. Now, we spoke a few moments ago to Rod Taylor, the leader of the Christian Heritage Party. I wanted to speak this segment to someone who is on the exact opposite end of the right. I mean, you have your Christian right and you have your libertarians, and it is the leader of the Libertarian Party of Canada, Tim Moen. Now, I am a conservatarian, which is a word that I think I invented. It means that libertarians think I'm too conservative and conservatives think I'm too libertarian. So I'm often finding myself not invited to any of the parties. But Tim Moen, an entertaining guy certainly, as well as an interesting guy, and has been the author of a viral campaign sign that even got him coverage around the world. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment's time. Tim Moen, leader of the Libertarian Party and candidate in Calgary, Signal Hill. Great to have you on the show, Tim. Thanks for coming on today.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So let's start with a really right out of the gate question. A lot of people know what libertarianism is, might not be as familiar with the Libertarian Party of Canada. So is it really just a party that takes a libertarian approach to all of the issues that the federal government addresses regularly?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. The philosophy of liberty is fairly simple. Don't hurt people, don't take your stuff, and don't do it even if you, win a popularity contest and call yourself the government. We just think that's a solid ethical rule to live by, and to the degree possible, we want to diminish the amount of force that government uses against peaceful people.
When it comes down to it, I can't imagine that there are many political leaders from any parties that have really fit in with what your vision for Canada is in recent generations.
No, that's true. I mean, it's not a popular position or philosophy to hold. It doesn't win you very many elections. Mostly people want free stuff, and they want you to relieve their anxieties and promise that everything's going to be all right. And that's what wins you elections. And so, it used to be, I think, that conservatives, at least paid lip service to smaller government and the ideas of liberty. But I see a bigger, more intrusive, more costly government than ever in Canadian history, I think. And we've had a conservative government for 3 years. And that's no mistake. It's just, I don't even blame the conservatives for that. I think they're doing the best they can. But, it's because we've lost our way, I think, as a nation to some degree. Culture is now just assumes that government is a committee of virtue there to solve all your problems. And to get elected, you have to toe that line or you're not going to get elected. And so the conservatives, if they want power, they have to say the things people want to hear.
You had, about a year ago, a line that just went absolutely viral, not just around Canada, but in the U.S. It was a meme that said, quote, "I want gay married couples to be able to protect their marijuana plants with guns." That pretty much encapsulates the idea of personal freedoms, I think, better than anything else I've ever heard. And that got you on Fox News. I know U.S. websites were writing about it. I mean, this was something that it took off, but I think because it encapsulates libertarianism in a very understandable way.
Yeah, absolutely. That slogan was gold for us. We tried a number of them, and that one took off, went around the world, really, and made a big splash. And, it's not to be confused. I mean, it's tongue in cheek and it's funny, but, the world that libertarians are looking for isn't one where there's a free flow of drugs and guns and gay marriage or anything like that. It's simply a world that's more peaceful, one that isn't pointing guns at people, even if they're doing something you don't agree with, some kind of vice or lifestyle that you don't agree with. We just don't want guns being pointed at those people by the government. And so, it really is about freedom. And in fact, most of us believe that there would be far less drug addiction and crime and society would over time become more virtuous if you simply got government out of the way and let what Edmund Burke called the small platoons, family, church, businesses, voluntary organizations, do the work of organizing society rather than this, overarching top-down approach that we currently have.
One of the problems I've always seen here in Ontario, because we have a provincial party that's the Libertarian Party of Ontario, is that they've always really flirted with that line of being anarchists almost. And we have on the other side of that the Freedom Party of Ontario, which I think takes more of an approach to what you're describing, which is not anarchy. You're not pushing for this like Rothbard-esque absence of government. You're basically saying we want decisions to be made through the lens of what gives people the most individual freedoms.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's what I've come to realize is that there's no end point called Libertopia, where we've now achieved a free society and we can all rest on our laurels and kick our feet up. Liberty is a process. It's an ongoing struggle and fight, and there's never going to be a place called Libertopia. And so what we're aiming to do with the party is, look, our principles are simply don't initiate force against another human being and take their stuff and hurt them. And let's see if we, and we have this overwhelming state and overwhelming government. There's no possible way we can restrain it in all the ways we would like. So let's see what we can do in one term of government to restrain it. Let's, just instead of reckless Hail Mary pass into the end zone we called Libertopia, let's just grind the ball down the field a yard at a time and see if we can make some headway that way.
It seems as though this election, especially this past week, has not been about jobs, has not been about the economy, has not been about taxes. It's been about kneecabs and terrorism. Now, don't get me wrong. Sure. I think that terrorism is an issue that Canadians need to address. I think it's an issue that all Western countries need to address. But what is the Libertarian Party position on kneecab bans during citizenship oaths, as well as stripping the citizenship of convicted terrorists?
Well, I mean, like all Canadians, we have mixed views within the party about this issue. I mean, my personal view is that I don't really understand why this has become a big federal issue. I think that that concessions could have been made, at the location by the people there, either the person wearing the kneecab or the people swearing oaths. Of course, people need to show their face for legal reasons and be identified. And, if you're a business and you want to be able to identify your customers and you don't want people coming in your store or your bank in balaclavas or burqas or whatever covers up your identity, you should have the right to refuse service to those people. But government shouldn't be in the business of telling people what they can and can't wear. You do need to show your face to government at times for legal reasons and security reasons. But I think this debate has been purposely divisive and needlessly so. It's I don't think I don't understand why it's a huge national issue right now. But you're right. There is a huge concern over terrorism, and rightfully so. There is a threat out there, and so I think people politicians are playing into that fear a bit.
So when we look at the other half of this issue that really falls under the same banner, I think, even though it's a different issue in that it's dominating and not necessarily for good reason, the election discussion, it's Bill C-24, the citizenship bill that was applied for the first time not long ago to get rid of the citizenship of a convicted terrorist. Is this something that your party supports or opposes, or you personally, if there is a divide in your party about it?
Yeah, we don't have an official platform with Bill C-24, but I'm of the opinion that you can lose your citizenship if you're a convicted terrorist, if you've gone through due process and you're convicted. And not just terrorism. I think any heinous crime, the Canadian government should be able to strip your citizenship if you hold a citizenship in another state. I think international law says that you can't be stateless. And so if you hold another citizenship elsewhere, I would have no problem stripping you of your citizenship if you're a threat to Canadians and convicted in open court.
One of the things that I've always enjoyed about parties that aren't part of the big three or the big four, such as the case may be, is that in addition to having unique perspectives on the issues that are central to the campaign, there's oftentimes completely different discussions. There are completely different issues that are brought up. What are some of the things that your party is pushing for, that you are pushing for Canada, that haven't really become part of the main campaign narratives we've seen from the other parties?
Well, one of the big issues I think that we continually harp on is the idea of fiscal federalism or decentralizing power in general. As I go to the candidates' debates, I hear from all the other candidates, including the Conservative. It's essentially a debate between the best way to manage, this giant business called Canada. Conservatives want daddy to be in charge. Liberals and NDP want mommy to be in charge. And we're kind of saying, no, people should be in charge of themselves. So, our conception is to decentralize power, and that requires limiting federal power and allowing provinces the ability to create the policies they want and keep more money in the policy, or keep more money in the provinces. So, I think that's I think that was the original kind of vision of the founders of this country, the fathers of Confederation, and that's something that we're bringing to the table this election that I think is different from anyone else.
And you've also pushed for, and I wish other parties would do this and see the value in this, a reform to the income tax system, pushing towards a flat tax, which I think is so long overdue in Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I get asked all the time, well, don't you think the rich should be taxed more? I said, well, listen, with a flat tax, the rich still is taxed more. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
15% of $50,000 is less than 15% of $1 million, right? And so, I tell people, should rich people pay more for a Big Mac or a bottle of shampoo? I mean, we all pay the same price for that. Maybe, I take it to the other extreme. What if every Canadian citizen just paid the same price for the services the government provided? I'm not going that far. I'm saying, look, let's at least not punish people for reaching higher in life. And so a flat tax is far fairer than a progressive tax where you're punished for reaching higher, for serving people more. I think that's incredibly unjust.
I wanted to ask, if I may, a question about you personally, because I think your story is really interesting here because, look, you're not a full-time politician. I'm going to take a wild guess and say not on a salary that can afford you the opportunity to not work, but you've had to, for this election, step away from your job. So this is a commitment, and I mean no offense by this, but for something that doesn't look like it's going to end with you being prime minister at the end of it, that you've taken here.
Well, how dare you, sir? You have little faith. No, of course. It's unlikely I'll even achieve a seat in Parliament, and this is not the goal. And you're right. I mean, I stepped away from, I was an acting battalion chief, making a comfortable six-figure salary and a public service pension. And I resigned from my position and gave up any chance of going back to that job to do this full time. This is a calling to me, and I think it needs to be done. To me, the idea that you can get into power and pull some legislative levers and create positive change in the world and in Canada is a futile endeavor, and that's the endeavor of other politicians and other parties. It's well-intentioned, but I think it eats itself, and it actually backfires. And so to me, the real work that needs to be done is people need to, make some sacrifices now and stand up for what they believe in and stand, in front of their fellow citizens and tell them some truths and some ideas that are probably unpopular and unlikely to win them popularity contests. But to me, that's the work that needs to be done. As culture changes, and research shows that when society hits a 10% tipping point of people who adopt an unshakable belief system, that the dominoes fall and the majority of the people adopt that. So this was true of abolition of slavery. It was true of civil rights. It was true of women's suffrage. And I think it can be true of liberty. And so to me, the idea is we hit a tipping point of 10% of people, and then the kind of government we want to see emerges from that. Government doesn't lead, it follows. And so that's the work we're doing.
Tim Moen joins me on the line, leader of the Libertarian Party of Canada and candidate for Parliament in Calgary, Signal Hill. Tim, appreciate you taking time to chat on the campaign trail. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
I just love that sign. I want gay married couples to be able to protect their marijuana plants with guns. I mean, what better way to encapsulate libertarianism for people that aren't really ideologues and aren't really familiar with it? And I think prove that there isn't simply a linear left versus right. Now, look, I've not at all proclaimed publicly how I intend to vote. But ultimately speaking, I believe in small government. I believe in lower taxes. I believe in greater individual and personal freedoms. And I don't think Justin Trudeau nor Thomas Mulcair are really pushing for any of those, let alone the bulk of them. And people can use their imagination in terms of what their own issues of significance and relevance are. But quite frankly, this election will be a matter of choosing the lesser of evils. And I think politics is always about that to some extent. I don't like how much of a central theme the niqab has come down or really has been in the campaign. But ultimately, I recognize that from a political perspective, it's clearly working. So what do you think in general about this election? We have one more show between now and Election Day. What would you like to hear on it? Andrew at andrewlawton.ca is my email address. You can also tweet me to @AndrewLawton. You're listening to Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. We'll be right back with a final wrap-up on the show. Stay tuned, Canada.
It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, only on Lawton Online. Scouring every corner of the globe for stories so outrageous, there must be a liberal involved.
Yes, indeed, it is time for It Must Be a Liberal, scouring every corner of the globe, from Calgary to Cape Verde, from Singapore to Sarasota. We scour every corner of the globe. Like I promised, finding the stories so outrageous, there must have been a liberal involved. And today we actually don't have to go more than a couple hours from where I am right now, and that is the good city of Youngstown, Ohio, where police were called to a house by a man with a complaint that he thought was fitting of emergency response. Now, the man ended up being arrested. He's 22 years old. He was crouched on the fetal position, or in the fetal position on the floor, groaning and surrounded by snacks that included Doritos, Goldfish crackers, and Chips Ahoy cookies. He told officers he couldn't feel his hands. The reason he called police were as follows. He was too high on marijuana, and he needed help. So when officers arrived, they also found near the Doritos, Goldfish crackers, and Chips Ahoy cookies a glass jar of marijuana, lots of paraphernalia. He refused medical treatment, so police have not yet charged him, but he was arrested, and it's still pending what's going to happen. But he called the cops on himself. Well, maybe he saw the error of his ways, or maybe he's just so moronic that in this case he is a perfect contender for it must be a liberal. There's really no other way to explain the situation. Folks, we've got to wrap things up for today. When we come back next week, we'll have the final show before the election. So like I said, let me know what you'd like to hear. My email address is andrew@andrewlawton.ca. Lawton Online resumes then. We'll be back and look forward to talking to you then. You're listening to Andrew Lawton here on TheRebel.Media. Thanks so much, Canada. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out TheRebel.Media for lots more fearless content and commentary.